ഡോക്ടർ ഡാനിയൽ ഇതിനകത്ത് പറയുന്നത് പോലെ റെസ്പോൺസിബിൾ ഗവൺമെന്റിന് വേണ്ടിയിട്ടുള്ളതാണ് തിരുവിതാംകൂറിന്റെ സ്വാതന്ത്ര്യ സമരം, ഉത്തരവാദ ഭരണത്തിന് വേണ്ടിയിട്ടുള്ളത്. അതിൽ നിന്ന് തന്നെ വ്യക്തമാക്കുന്നത് ഉത്തരവാദിത്വം തീർത്തും ഇല്ലാതിരുന്ന ഒരു ഭരണ വ്യവസ്ഥയായിരുന്നു ഈ തിരുവിതാംകൂറിൽ 20-ാം നൂറ്റാണ്ടിലും. ഇതിപ്പോൾ പ്രത്യേകിച്ചും 20-ാം നൂറ്റാണ്ടിൻ്റെ ഈ കാലമാണ് അദ്ദേഹം അതിൻ്റെ ചരിത്ര വിഷയം ആക്കി. 1930 മുതൽ 47 വരെയുള്ള, പ്രത്യേകിച്ചും അതിന് മുമ്പൊക്കെ പോകുന്നുണ്ടെങ്കിലും നമ്മളിപ്പോൾ പലപ്പോഴും കണ്ടുമുട്ടുന്നത് ആ ഒരു ഭരണത്തിൻ്റെയും ആ ഭരണത്തിനെ നയിച്ച രാഷ്ട്രീയ, സാമൂഹ്യ, ജാതീയ, വർഗീയമായിട്ടുള്ള താല്പര്യങ്ങളുടെയൊക്കെ ഒരു ഭീകരമായ അവസ്ഥയിൽ നിന്ന് നമ്മൾ വളരെ വേഗം അവയൊക്കെ മറന്നു പോവുകയും അവയെ എങ്ങനെയൊക്കെ മഹത്വവൽക്കരിക്കാനോ അവയൊക്കെ എങ്ങനെയൊക്കെ പ്രകീർത്തിക്കാനോ കഴിയും എന്നുള്ള സാധ്യതകൾ ആരായുന്നതാണ് പലപ്പോഴും പുരോഗമനകാരികൾ എന്ന് വിശ്വസിക്കുന്ന, പുരോഗമന രാഷ്ട്രീയ പ്രസ്ഥാനത്തിൽ പോലും വിശ്വസിക്കുന്നവരുടെ മുമ്പിലുള്ള ഒരു രീതി, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ അവർ അനുവർത്തിക്കുന്ന ഒരു രീതി എന്നുള്ളത് പലപ്പോഴും അമ്പരപ്പിക്കുന്ന കാര്യമാണ്. അത് ഈ സമൂഹത്തിൽ മാറി വരുന്ന അല്ലെങ്കിൽ മേധാവിത്വം വഹിച്ചു വരുന്ന ഒരു മൂല്യങ്ങളുടെ മാറ്റത്തിൻ്റെ ഭാഗമായിരിക്കാം. അങ്ങനെയുള്ള നിലപാടുകളെ അതിശക്തമായി ചോദ്യം ചെയ്യുന്നു എന്നുള്ളതാണ് ഈ പുസ്തകത്തിൻ്റെ, പ്രൊഫസർ ഡാനിയലിൻ്റെ ഈ പുസ്തകത്തിൻ്റെ ഏറ്റവും പ്രധാനപ്പെട്ട സംഭാവന. കാരണം ചരിത്രത്തിൽ നിന്ന് ചരിത്രത്തിലേക്ക്, അടുത്ത ഘട്ടത്തിലേക്ക് പോകുമ്പോഴേക്കും വളരെ വേഗം നമ്മൾ മറന്നു പോവുകയും ബോധപൂർവം മറക്കാൻ ശ്രമിക്കുകയൊക്കെ ചെയ്യുന്ന കാര്യങ്ങളെ വീണ്ടും നമ്മുടെ മുമ്പിൽ നിർത്തി ഇവയൊക്കെ എന്തായിരുന്നു, എങ്ങനെയായിരുന്നു, എന്താണ് രാജഭരണം അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ദിവാൻ ഭരണം എന്തായിരുന്നു. ഇന്നിപ്പോൾ ഒരു തിരുവനന്തപുരത്ത് ഒരു 10 പേരെ കണ്ടാൽ ഒരു പക്ഷേ 5 പേരോ 6 പേരെങ്കിലും അല്ലെങ്കിൽ 7 പേരെങ്കിലും അത് ദിവാൻ ഭരണവും രാജഭരണവും ഒക്കെ വളരെ കേമപ്പെട്ടതായിരുന്നു എന്ന് നിരന്തരം കേൾക്കുന്ന ഒരു കാലമാണിത്. സർ സി പി രാമസ്വാമി അയ്യർ എന്ന് പറയുന്ന മനുഷ്യനെ കുറിച്ച് ഒരുപാട് പുസ്തകങ്ങൾ ഇറങ്ങിയിട്ടുണ്ട്. അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ പേരിലുള്ള ഒരു ഫൗണ്ടേഷൻ നിരന്തരമായി അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ പ്രതിച്ഛായ വർദ്ധിപ്പിക്കാനും അദ്ദേഹം എത്ര വലിയ കേമനായിരുന്നു എന്ന് കാണിക്കാനും ഒക്കെ നിരന്തരം അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ ഫൗണ്ടേഷനും കുടുംബങ്ങളും ശ്രമിക്കുന്നുണ്ട്. അതൊക്കെ അവരുടെ ഇഷ്ടം. മാത്രമല്ല പലപ്പോഴും നമ്മൾ കേൾക്കുന്ന ഒരു കാര്യമാണ്, അദ്ദേഹം അല്പം ഭരണാധികാരിയായി അല്പം കടുപ്പക്കാരനായിരുന്നു, പക്ഷേ അദ്ദേഹം ചെയ്ത സംഭാവന, അദ്ദേഹം ഈ നാടിന് നൽകിയ സംഭാവന, അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ ഭരണപ്രാപ്തി, അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ കാര്യക്ഷമത, ഇങ്ങനെയൊക്കെയുള്ള സംഭാഷണങ്ങൾ ഇന്ന് നമുക്ക് നമ്മുടെ മധ്യവർഗ സദസ്സുകളിലും ഒരുപക്ഷെ പുരോഗമന അദ്ദേഹത്തിനെതിരായിട്ടുള്ള രാഷ്ട്രീയ പ്രസ്ഥാനങ്ങൾ നയിച്ചവരുടെ അനന്തരാവകാശികളിൽ നിന്നുമൊക്കെ കേൾക്കാറുള്ളതാണ്. അവിടെയാണ് പ്രൊഫസർ ഡാനിയൽ പറയുന്നത് ഈ നല്ല ഭരണം, കാര്യക്ഷമത എന്ന് പറയുന്നതും ജനാധിപത്യവും തമ്മിൽ ഒരു വലിയ വിടവുണ്ട്. ആ വിടവ് നികത്താത്ത ഒരു നല്ല ഭരണത്തിനും, അതായത് ജനാധിപത്യത്തിൽ വിശ്വസിക്കാത്ത ഒരു സോക്കോൾഡ് നല്ല ഭരണത്തിനും നിലനിൽപ്പില്ല, സ്ഥായിയായ നിലനിൽപ്പില്ല. ഗുഡ് ഗവേണൻസ് ഇസ് നോ സബ്സ്റ്റിറ്റ്യൂട്ട് ഫോർ സെൽഫ് ഗവേണൻസ് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്, ഗുഡ് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ അത് വീണ്ടും സബ്ജക്റ്റീവാണ്. അപ്പോൾ അത് എനിക്ക് തോന്നുന്നത് അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ പുസ്തകത്തിലുള്ള, അദ്ദേഹം അതിനകത്ത് വളരെ കൃത്യമായി പറയുന്നുണ്ട്. തിരുവിതാംകൂറിലെ ചരിത്ര അല്ലെങ്കിൽ തിരുവിതാംകൂറിൻ്റെയോ കേരളത്തിൻ്റെ ഈ കാലഘട്ടത്തിൻ്റെ ചരിത്രം എഴുതിയവരെല്ലാവരും പലരും ഈ കാര്യത്തിൽ പറയുമ്പോഴും പറയോ എന്നാലും അദ്ദേഹം, അപ്പോൾ അവിടെയാണ് എത്രമാത്രം ജനാധിപത്യ വിരുദ്ധനായ അങ്ങേയറ്റത്തെ റൂട്ട്ലെസ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു സ്വേച്ഛാധികാരിയായിരുന്നു ഈ മനുഷ്യൻ എന്നുള്ളത് ഒരുപക്ഷെ കുറച്ച് നാൾ മുമ്പ് എല്ലാവർക്കും പറഞ്ഞിരുന്നതാണ്. പക്ഷേ സമീപകാലത്ത് ആരും ഇത്രയും വിശദമായി, ഇത്രയും സൂക്ഷ്മാംശങ്ങളിലേക്ക് കടന്നുകൊണ്ടുള്ള ഒരു പഠനമോ ഒരു വിശകലനമോ നടത്തിയിട്ടില്ല എന്നുള്ളതാണ് ഇതിൻ്റെ ഏറ്റവും പ്രധാനപ്പെട്ട സംഭാവന. ഇവിടെ എങ്ങനെയാണ് സർ സി പി രാമസ്വാമി അയ്യർ ഇവിടുത്തെ കമ്മ്യൂണിസ്റ്റ് പ്രസ്ഥാനത്തിനെ അടിച്ചമർത്താനോ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ സ്റ്റേറ്റ് കോൺഗ്രസിനെ അടിച്ചമർത്താനോ ഒക്കെ ശ്രമിച്ചിരുന്ന കാലഘട്ടത്തിൽ എങ്ങനെയാണ് കൊച്ചിയിലെ ദിവാൻ വ്യത്യസ്തമായ നിലപാട് സ്വീകരിച്ചത്? ബോർഡ് എന്ന് പറയുന്ന ഒരു ബ്രിട്ടീഷുകാരനായി എങ്ങനെയാണ് സർ സി പി പറഞ്ഞിരുന്നതെല്ലാം എന്തൊരു നുണയാണ് എന്ന് അദ്ദേഹം മദ്രാസിലെ ഗവർണർ എഡ്വേർഡ്സിന് അയക്കുന്ന കത്തുകളിലൂടെ അദ്ദേഹം വിശദമായി പറയുന്നുണ്ട്. എങ്ങനെയാണ് ഈ സർ സി പി പറയുന്നതൊന്നും ശരിയല്ല, അദ്ദേഹം പറയുന്ന ഈ വെറും എക്സാജറേറ്റഡ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള അങ്ങേയറ്റത്തെ അതിര് കടന്ന തരത്തിലുള്ള വർത്തമാനങ്ങളും ആരോപണങ്ങളും എങ്ങനെയാണ് ഉന്നയിക്കുന്നത് എന്നുള്ളത് ഈ സർക്കിളിനുള്ളിൽ തന്നെ നമ്മുടെ തൊട്ടപ്പുറത്ത് കിടക്കുന്ന ഈ കൊച്ചി രാജ്യത്തെ ദിവാൻ എങ്ങനെ വിശദമായി, ഇതൊക്കെ വാസ്തവത്തിൽ എന്നെ സംബന്ധിച്ചിടത്തോളം വളരെ പുതിയ വിവരങ്ങളാണ്. എല്ലാവർക്കും അങ്ങനെ ആവണമെന്നില്ല.
And it's fascinating to see the evolution of Tiruvannamalai in this way. In the 19th century, you see the rise of Brahminical domination. We don't have too many Brahmins native to Kerala, but they were imported from neighboring states. And they came in essentially to be Diwans. I mean, first of all, the balance between the monarch and the Diwan had already been disturbed under the British. When you first started having British residents at the cusp of the late 18th, early 19th century, obviously they exercised more power than Diwans in the past had been able to, and you all remember the failed rebellion of Veluthappi and so on. Subsequently, their role basically was taken over by Indian Diwans, who were mainly Brahmins and some Raos also, as you mentioned. And these Diwans essentially became autonomous power centers to a great extent, depending, of course, on the capability and inclinations of the Raja of the day. And tracing this increase in Brahminical dominance, the phenomenal overrepresentation of Brahmins in every governmental position in the court, but also in government departments and in the administration, the awakening of consciousness amongst the Nayars and the Iravas, the Nayars then choosing the same technique of the Brahmins of actually acquiring English education in order to be able to take advantage of these opportunities, then the Iravas following suit. All of this is very, very interestingly traced and described with specific reference to what happened in Travancore. And of course, then the class factor comes in. Ajay is right that the rise of these communities also parallels the rise of the Indian National Congress. And their demand for responsible government in the states. Remember that the Indian National Congress fought against the British in British India. In the princely states, at least nominally, there was no British rule. It was supposed to be Maharaja's rule. And so the formulation taken by Congress party sympathizers in the princely states was the formulation of responsible government that is responsible to the people. That was the whole notion of the nationalist movement at that time. And what we see in this situation is that in addition to these phenomena of the caste groups waking up to Brahminical dominance and claiming their own share of the pie, you also had the rise of other communities. For example, the Catholics of Travancore started becoming conscious, so other religious groups also started demanding their share of the pie. And then you had class consciousness coming in. Started off with the Travancore Youth League, which essentially became the nucleus of the Communist Party. And the rise of communism is also traced in exquisite detail. I mean, as I mentioned, with reference to that one footnote, there is a great deal there. So I don't need to repeat what M.G. Radhakrishnan has already said about the book, what its publisher, Ravindranath Nair, has said about the book in terms of praising it. But being here as somebody who's meant to provoke a little bit of discussion, I'm going to offer some somewhat less flattering comments in a minute. Before doing that, I do particularly want to stress that on the basics, it is impossible to quarrel with Dr. Daniel. His work of scholarship is so profound. But as Ajay Radhakrishnan said, he does have a point of view. And in the process of expressing that point of view, I find that he has been somewhat excessively indulgent of the communist movement in the state, particularly in that period. I think 31 to 47 was chosen probably because 31 is when Chitra Tirunal, when he had actually been monarch from the death of his brother, but he was essentially under the tutelage of the senior Maharani. And the senior Maharani actually ran the state as regent for 6 years. But when he turned 18, he had the right to become king, and to his shock, the British refused to approve his accession. So when the British would not approve his accession, he requested Sir C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer, who knew, to go and intercede on his behalf, and Sir C.P. spoke to the Viceroy. And the Viceroy, because Sir C.P. was a member of the Viceroy's Executive Council, I think as law member, if I'm not mistaken, and the Viceroy said, I will allow this young boy to become the Maharaja if you agree to serve as his legal and constitutional advisor. So from 31 onwards, Sir CP played a strong role in the state. 31 to 37, he served as legal and constitutional advisor, and then in 37, at the invitation of Chitra Thirunal, he became the Diwan himself. Now, what is interesting is that in all this time, you saw the communists essentially doing a lot to awaken the consciousness of the people, particularly the working classes, the poor, the factory workers, and so on. But what is forgotten in this is that they were following a policy of utmost slavish obedience to Moscow. So you had a situation when, in the name of anti-fascism, they were able to associate themselves with the freedom struggle. Then, when the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was concluded in 1938, the communists suddenly stopped talking about anti-fascism, because suddenly, since the communists were in bed with the fascists, that was all right, you can't oppose fascists anymore. Then in 1939, when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, suddenly anti-fascism came back into vogue. Then when the Congress Party was opposing the British, the communists actually became sympathetic to the British, because the British were allied with the Soviet Union in fighting the Germans and the Axis powers. And so when the Congress Party called the Quit India movement, for example, the Communist Party absented itself from it. It was a series of twists and turns, which suggests to me that no principle or ideology was truly involved. It was simply what was good for Moscow that mattered to our friends in the Communist Party at that time. And I think that it's important for us to realize that what is striking is that these were communists who in many ways had been at the forefront of the nationalist movement. In my recent book on Ambedkar, I have quoted EMS as attacking Ambedkar for putting what he called the mundane issue of Harijan advancement above the transcendent cause of independence. And so the communists had been staunch nationalist figures, even to the tune of attacking Ambedkar for advancing Dalit interests ahead of nationalist interests. And the same communists suddenly became fellow travelers of the British when the British and the communists in the Soviet Union were together. So these are points we cannot, to my mind, entirely escape in looking at the context of this. The second and only other criticism that I would make is that I think, whereas again, M.G. Radhakrishnan has spoken very strongly in favor of the same point of view, I think that one, from the facts that Dr. Daniel has assembled, rightly comes out with a very negative and critical view of these years of monarchical and Diwan autocracy in Travancore, and there's no problem with that. But there is insufficient acknowledgement, it seems to me, of the fact that Chitra Thirunal's reign marked revolutionary progress in Travancore in various fields, in the fields of education, defense, economy, society. One forgets, for example, that Sir CP had been a secretary of the All India Congress Committee back in 1917. He had been a staunch advocate of Home Rule. He only parted from the Congress because of his disagreement with Mahatma Gandhi's non-cooperation movement, which many reformists disagreed with. Sir Chetu Shankaran Nair was another example. So there was nothing, at the time of Jallianwala Bagh, for example, Sir CP was very much a congressman. But he strongly pushed the Maharaja towards the Temple Entry Proclamation of 1936, which was one of the major social reforms, not just of Travancore, but of India. And I think that was something that we have to acknowledge, because we found for the first time all castes, including the so-called untouchables of the day, what we would call Dalits today, being allowed into the temples of Travancore. And it was an astonishingly well-received decision across the country, including by Mahatma Gandhi. But it's not just that I wanted to talk about. The first public transport system from Thiruvananthapuram to Mavelikara was done by the Diwan and Sir CP. The first telecommunication system, the first telephones were installed during that time. The industrialization of the state started under Chitra Thirunal and Sir CP, because they established heavy industry and they put the money in from their own tax revenues, heavy public sector involvement. 20 industries were established in order to take advantage for the people of Thiruvananthapuram of the natural resources here, particularly rubber, chemicals and minerals. And so, if we today celebrate, or not today so much in this era of privatization, but even if, say, 10 years ago we celebrated the very strong public sector infrastructure in the state that employed so many people and helped so many workers, the credit actually goes to Chitra Tirunal and Sir CP, because everything from the Indian Aluminium Company, Travancore Titanium, FACT in Alua, there's no question, the Viceroy of India was deeply opposed to a princely state developing fertilizers and chemicals. We were going to be the first place in India to manufacture ammonium sulfate. The Viceroy stopped it. So Sir CP went and worked out American collaboration in order to set up FACT in Travancore. We can't forget these things. The first plant to manufacture cement in southern India was in Travancore. Another one that, to manufacture titanium dioxide, I mentioned Travancore Titaniums. The Travancore plywood factory at Punalur was also done. Travancore Rayons Limited was established with the plant at Perumbavoor in 1946. The first plant to establish aluminium cables anywhere in India was established in Kundara, also in Travancore. The attempt to establish a hydroelectric power plant in the Periyar River was blocked by the British, using the government of Madras to block it. So what Sir CP did was to go off using his legal skills and argue a legal case before the courts that overcame the objections of the government of Madras, and they created the Pallivasal hydroelectric power plant on the Periyar. There were 3 or 4 major hydroelectric plants coming up at that time, Pechipura, Kodayar, and so on. And then you also had the Periyar Game Sanctuary. What it did for tourism, we all know. The guest houses built in Kanyakumari, also by Sir CP and Sir Chitra Tirunal. The appointment of an arts advisor, the first princely state anywhere in the country to have an art advisor to the Maharaja. The establishment of the University of Travancore, with the Maharaja as Chancellor and Sir CP as Vice Chancellor. And as you know, the Maharaja wrote to Albert Einstein, inviting him to become the first Chancellor, and he turned it down. So there was a certain amount of vision here. And, I was just thinking, we're going through, I just conducted an inspection of our new national highway extension from Karakotam to Tharoor, the Tamil Nadu border. And what is interesting is that this has been done at the Greenfield Project 4 lanes. The road ends at the Tamil Nadu border because Tamil Nadu has not been able to build a stretch from that point all the way to Kanyakumari. And yet, who built the first ever cement highway in India? Again, this pair of Sir CP and Chitra Tirunal built a cement highway all the way from Trivandrum to Kanyakumari. The first lady district judge in India, Anna Chandi, who also later became the first High Court judge, was a woman, also appointed by these people. So I think I completely understand Dr. Daniel's criticisms. I fully accept Ajay's endorsement of them. But I do want to say that this was not just a black and white issue. This was somebody who did some extraordinary things which continued to benefit generations of people in Trivandrum for many years. And I have to say that, yes, we cannot forgive what happened at Punapura Vayalar in 1946, when the communists attempted to establish their own government in the area, and it had to be put down. Now, you can say that it was put down with great cruelty. I think everyone agrees that about 1,000 people were killed at that time by the Travancore Army and even Navy was firing at Alappuzha and Cherthala. And it was the whole tragedy could have been avoided. But where can you imagine any administrative governmental authority allowing a group of communists or any other ideology, doesn't matter, to set up their own government inside the borders of a state? That is simply not going to be permitted, whether it is today's home ministers in any state or in Delhi, or whether it was CP. I don't think it would have been permitted. So all I'm saying is, yes, there was cruelty shown. There was many of us continue to commemorate the heroes and victims of the agitations and the nationalist movement of that period. But I do believe that we do need to accept that in many ways, these two gentlemen, Chitra Tirunal was a visionary king, and Sir CP, who assisted, abetted, and implemented all of these initiatives, deserve a little more than a black and white rendition of their record. I might add that I completely part company with Sri Chitra Tirunal on the question of Travancore independence. In fact, Sir C.P. is blamed for it. I too used to believe that, but there is more and more evidence that he actually wanted only to negotiate a degree of autonomy for the former princely states, of which Travancore would be the prime example. But it was Chitra Tirunal, by that time a fairly assertive monarch, who said, no, we should ask for independence. And as you know, it ended very badly. We had Travancore sending an ambassador to Delhi and to Karachi. Karachi fellow was received with great fanfare. The fellow in Delhi was sent off with a flea in his ear, being told there would be no ambassador because your state is going to have to join the Union. And at the end of the day, the state merged, and of course we all know the rest of the story. But this book nonetheless gives us a terrific foundation to appreciate the nature of the struggle, the extraordinary amount of information from primary sources that Dr. Daniel has put together. All I was pleading for was for an appreciation of the complexities. Just as he has so brilliantly shown us the complexities of caste, class, and religion, we also should appreciate the complexities from the point of view of the rulers of that time. There was no democracy anywhere in India. The British were not democrats. Even as late as the 1946 election, in a country of 330 million people, only 30 million were allowed to vote. So there was no democracy. And in the princely states, there's even less democracy because the monarchs felt that they had a divine right to rule. And in the case of Travancore, as we know, the monarchs were ruling in the name of God. Padmanabhadasa was the monarch, after all, his principal title. So in those circumstances, to judge them by the standards of today is normal and natural for all of us. But I think we are overlooking one element of the study of history here, which is the need to empathize to some degree with the thought processes of the people of that time. I don't want to come across as an apologist for monarchy. I'm not a monarchist. I'm not here as an apologist for Sir C.P. either. But I look at the past from the point of view of those who were living in the past and who were exercising their best judgment with all the biases and so on at that time. And I find that whereas we are all happy with the outcome and we welcome our democracy and we welcome the extraordinary rise of consciousness amongst the poor, the untouchables, the working classes, everyone. While we do all of that, we should also give a little bit of credit, particularly for the industrialization and progress of the state, to the otherwise reviled Maharaja and Diwan of that period.
Good government is no substitute for self-government. Briefly touched upon this. To all the wonderful things that Sir C.P. had engineered and our monarch had sanctioned, history tells us that this would never be equivalent to the people's right to govern themselves. We can argue about this point for hours.
No, right.
But the short point is that in the desire of a people to express themselves, to take decisions in their own hands, to become self-governing, on the other side of the balance, you cannot say, but we are giving you good government. And that is not a counterpoint that can be accepted. And I think Dr. Daniel, Professor Daniel, in this book, the main strand is this. What are the conflicts that happened against the monarchy? So I think perhaps Dr. Tharoor, given an option, I'm sure Professor Daniel also would have agreed with you that there were several things that regime had done which lasted tangible legacy to the state. That cannot be put into the context of the conflicts and of the struggles and of all the unspeakable things that happened in the last part in the 14-15 years that has been studied in this book. The second point I wanted to make is second and third points are personal in nature. Number one is I'm fascinated to understand that the English records are kept in the cellar of the Secretariat. I happen to be habituated in that space for the last 20 years. And I thought that most of the records, all the records had already moved into the archives elsewhere. But Professor Daniel says that he was given access in those recesses somewhere down in our basement, in our secretariat, which has thrown up rich material for him. And I'm looking forward, Professor, to go deep into this book and understand the references and perhaps, do a quick run into the cellars and read those things myself. This brings me to another point also. The references, I was just looking at the references. The National Archives also has yielded some material to you, although quite sketchy, I thought. I was fortunate to be in the Ministry of Culture, Joint Secretary, where I had the pleasure of spending a lot of wonderful hours with scholars, people of eminence, one of whom was the DG of the National Archives, Professor Mushrul Hassan, who was a scholar who took the time, who spent the time that he was DG in order to spur scholarship, in order to encourage students to get in there. He opened the doors of the archives in many ways, but he would always complain that, Dr. Venu, there's nobody from your state who has come to me with a request. There is so much of material here that will throw light on different aspects of your history, and that has not been explored. So here it is, two interesting sources, both of which our learned professor has shown a light on the English records in our archives here, and another scholar pointing out that National Archives still waits to see more and more scholars and researchers to provide that connection to the public so that they understand their history better. I think our history departments need to take stock of this and try to stimulate people to pick up these subjects and delve a little deeper in this. I did 1 year of higher education, principal secretary higher education. I had only a very sketchy idea, but what I saw I did not like. Much of what I saw that went in the name of doctoral thesis and research papers, I was quite disappointed. So I think there is this book in a very quiet way tells us that there is so much of work waiting for scholars, and I think it's incumbent on our academia to take up this challenge and take up and encourage more and more scholars to work better and work deeper. The second point I wanted to make was that I can't be objective about this, just as Professor Daniel can't be. My father happened to be a youngster whose hand was, the police of Sir CP beat the shit out of him when he was a student. He broke his arm and he carried that injury in small ways for the rest of his life. He was not a big speaker. He would not talk too much. He was a very taciturn man. But what he said then, in my formative years, he would just indicate to me that it is unspeakable what the Diwan did. And I think that is the feeling which a lot of us carry, even the second, third generation people. When we talk about the Diwan, unfortunately, we can't be objective. I'm while agreeing with you again, but when we talk about the political struggles of our state, of Travancore, it is difficult to be objective because immediately you have these images. And as Professor Daniel said, there are several strands here. It is an anti-monarchist stand, but there was also a huge struggle against all the indignities, all the unspeakable evils that were perpetrated on the lower classes. You had the communists. I am positive, Dr. Tharoor, 99% of the communists who were working with the kayar workers, with the agricultural laborers, had no idea about Moscow. That was done by some very esoteric, discussions in some other forum. Here are people who were working with the most depressed of the classes, telling them that you have a better life ahead and we need to struggle for that. it's a glorious chapter. We might disagree with the methodology, we might disagree with the ideology that made these youngsters come out and work with them, but you cannot deny the fact that it is their blood and sweat that transformed the lives of these people, that transformed the thoughts of these people from being mere slaves to people who thought that they could change the world. And I think this book again is through reports from the other side tells us that story. Reports of the police writing to their superiors about how these guys are ganging up, going together, how there are 3 or 4 people who are eternally found, in the camps, in the villages, talking to these people, talking to the workers. It's a fascinating way of how small, barefoot workers of the Communist Party lit up these little flames across the villages, across those miserable housing where these people were staying, and through that ignited this movement, which it cannot be denied was part and parcel of the force that was there that made the Maharaja take the decision finally. So I think with these words, I would just want to say that this is another formidable work of scholarship that adds to our knowledge of that wonderful that period, which needs to be understood in much more detail, because we tend to gloss over the work of a lot of unknown people. My father included. Maybe as a youngster, who knows, whether he and a few others, they were inspired by this person called Srikandan Nair. Srikandan Nair was a 28, 30-year-old labor activist, trade union activist. Became RSP leader, MP for 5 terms, MP. But Srikandan Nair was a person, I'm told, through this family stories, that would attract youngsters. Today, the RSP is a poor, I would say, just a shadow of what it was. And all the people who believed in, or who were inspired by Srikandan Nair and who went into trade union movements, like my father, were all people who believed that they were all contributing to change. They were contributing in their own little ways to change. So every book that throws light on this area is also a celebration and a tribute to such people.